I want to be clear, it is absolutely not my intention to, for example, brag about myself. It just so happens that the career I know the very best is my own. So I'm using it as today's example. And I call it From Solar Cells to Sustainable Materials. And so here we go, assuming it will go. All right. So the first question I pose is, can you plan your career? And so we've had the pleasure of collaborating for many years with one of the most famous names in material science, Professor Mike Ashby of Cambridge. And here's Mike, fully active, even though he's in his 80s, and he's published fantastic work since the 1960s. If some of you are in material science, you may recognize things like the Ashby plot of materials creep, the Ashby material selection method. So it's fantastic insight. So we asked Mike, can you plan your career? And he said, of course you cannot plan your career. I couldn't. But if you do excellent work, opportunities will emerge. So some of you may have heard the little saying, the harder I try, the luckier I get. And that's closely related to this statement. So it turns out if at a given moment, if whatever you're doing, you do it really well, in a sense, you become the right person in the right place for the next opportunity. Right? When an opportunity comes up and others are thinking, gee, who do we approach? Who do we want to get involved in that? You will end up being that person. And so I really can't emphasize this enough. It's very simple, but very profound. And let me put forward at this stage 4 career suggestions. This is perhaps food for discussion later on. And this is drawn partly from my research career and partly from my teaching experience. So first of all, it's very important to have depth. And I'll call it disciplinary depth of understanding, because what is at the core of an engineering system or a larger issue generally is complex. So you have to go deep to learn the real issues. But the second thing you need really is cross-disciplinary breadth, where you perhaps don't need the full depth of understanding, but you need to appreciate the insights of other fields. And I call this have perspective, reevaluate what you're doing with systems thinking. How does it connect? And we do this a lot in sustainability. In fact, sustainability is almost entirely about seeing a linkage between things. The third point, and one which I enjoyed in my career, was to seek opportunities and rise to challenges, i.e. ask. And many of the things that were fantastic for me came about simply because I asked around and discovered opportunities that I never knew existed. And finally, which is kind of for the long run, as you're out there in your career doing things, there will come strategic moments when the best way forward is to embrace new topics. And part of embracing new topics is you drop stale ones, because you need the time to embrace new topics. I will say many of these things, perhaps all of these things, you will have heard before, but I put them here because I found them so profoundly important. Okay, let's move on. Using me as the example, let's put in my pathway, professional pathway. So I did my undergraduate degree in engineering and applied science. So that was kind of engineering physics blend at Yale University. And then I actually worked for 2 years at what is now NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory. That's just outside of Denver, Colorado. And then I did a 3rd year of research, actually in Paris, France, at the École Polytechnique. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And after 3 years of being out of college, but those were a very productive 3 years doing research, I then went to grad school. That was at Stanford, where I did a PhD in material science and engineering. And then happily and wonderfully came to U of I, where I have been since 1988. And here I am now. So, right, I like to say that U of I is kind of the geometric mean between all that east and all that west, right? I finally settled at the fulcrum. So I want to just take a minute and explain how each of these things came about. You know, I, as a teenager and then an early college student, had lived through the earlier energy crisis of the 70s with fuel lines, a lot more air pollution than there is now. It was very inspiring. And that was a period when solar photovoltaics was really still in its infancy. The principle was well known, but it cost at that time 50, 75 times more than it costs today. So where we are today was just a dream at that point. So in my junior year, I got fired up about this. And I asked one of my professors, Professor Ma, if there were opportunities in solar cells. And he said, well, why don't you do a senior thesis? And I have in mind a new device design, which it turns out didn't work very well, but it was my introduction into semiconductor physics and thin film materials. And it was very, very formative. Then in my senior year, I asked around because I was interested in working in research. And one professor that I knew only a little bit opened his desk and pulled out an organizational chart of the newly formed Solar Energy Research Institute, what is now NREL. And we looked at the chart and figured out who was running the new photovoltaics branch. And I sent my resume to that person. And soon I had landed a job where, in fact, during 2 years, I put together the laboratory for thin film amorphous silicon and made the first thin film solar cell at NREL, which actually is here in my desk drawer. It's very rugged. It was 2% efficient at the time, and it's still 2% efficient. No degradation. Now, while I was working there, we had a sabbatical visitor, a visiting scientist, Gilles Dohony, and asked in French, would I not mind working at his lab in Paris for a year? I deliberated this very deeply for about a quarter of a second and responded in French, I wouldn't mind really too much. So that's when I went off to his laboratory for a very, very insightful experience. So after that was grad school and did various things there, but I'll say at grad school, I met my future bride. And she planned to attend the University of Illinois for a music doctorate. So to make the really biggest correct decision in my life, which was to be with her, I searched for and found a postdoc at U of I, and it turned out it was the very year when the material science department had been formed by modernizing the old metallurgy and ceramic engineering departments, and they were about to have a whole string of new faculty hires. And I'm number 2 of that original set of faculty hires. So that was great. Now, various wonderful, wonderful things happened here at U of I, and I can only recount a few of them. So sitting in my office at U of I, one of our juniors, Jennifer Gaddis, came into my office and suggested that I teach a course about sustainable materials. But not actually. She told me to do it. That's Jennifer Gaddis. And I said, I'll do it if you work with me. And so we actually co-developed it with Jennifer as an undergraduate. That was in 2007. Now it's my favorite course. And in fact, it's being taught this fall. We have already 45 students signed up. That means I'll have 45 term papers to read and comment on. So I'll have a busy fall. Now, that's on the teaching side. What about research? A great opportunity and strength of this campus is the collaborative culture And I've enjoyed that on many occasions. So in my group, I had been doing growth of thin films using a technique called chemical vapor deposition. And at one point I paused just to reflect on this. And I said, now I'm doing this, the group next door is doing this. How many chemists do I see? And the answer was 0. And I said, how come all of us are doing chemical vapor deposition with no true expertise in chemistry? So I asked around, and I was steered to a colleague in chemistry, Greg Girolami, and his thing is to invent new molecules. And he gives them to me, we walk them down the street, we use them in my thin film growth apparatus, and we make thin films do things which are, conventionally speaking, impossible. Here, by the way, is a cross-sectional electron micrograph. It had, the substrate here had originally been grooved. There are a series of trenches, which is the darker gray, and the lighter gray is a film we have deposited. Now, normally, and up here is the top of the substrate, and this is down in the grooves. Normally, a film grows thickest on the top, and the molecule you are using is slowly consumed because it reacts on the walls on the way down. So it's thicker on top and too thin at the bottom. But what you see is the opposite. We have tricked Mother Nature, tricked the growth kinetics into growing less on top and more in the bottom. And in fact, we now have 4 independent ways to do this. So it's at the intersection of the chemistry, thinking about the surface physics, thinking about the transport of molecules through the gas phase. We've had a wonderful time. And Greg and I have been collaborating since 1998. So I think about 20 PhDs have come out of what we call the joint group. Now, collaborations. At one point, I served on a committee that studied what did the College of Engineering have in the areas of energy and sustainability. And what we discovered was that there were already on the books and being taught 24 advanced courses. But there was no focus, there was no package around it. This was because individual faculty had said, this matters, and I'm therefore going to teach this course. So it was a wonderful example of the low-hanging fruit. And what we decided, I worked with loads and loads and loads of colleagues. Here are the principals, Paul DeBevick and Cliff Singer. Paul's in physics, Cliff is in nuclear engineering and in political science. And we created a graduate program called Energy and Sustainability Engineering. Now, people have asked me, how did you do this? Right? Seems impossible. And I respond, it's just no problem at all. All you need to do is negotiate with each of the 12 department heads in engineering and the dean, and then the 3 of us collectively probably invested 3,000 to 5,000 volunteer hours. So it's easy on top of everything else we're doing. You just do this and you're all set. Which is an interesting story. You will understand quite correctly that by doing this, I was not continuing to build my research career. I was not trying to have a group with 10, 15 PhD students. But this was something I felt was tremendously important. We now have hundreds of students over the years go through our courses. A very large number have done the certificate or now the master's degree. So in my view, this was more important to do than adding another 100 publications to my resume. That's a career choice. Others would make a different choice, but we all decided that this was the thing to do. So I will wrap up and just say, for me, none of this just started when I was in college. The pathway started when I was very young. And we'll start at the New Hampshire Craft Fair, which has really wonderful artisans. So the New Hampshire Craft Fair in about let's say 1968. And there was a practicing blacksmith, Joe Tucker, actually very famous in that region, and asked if I wanted to make something. And I did, and then I never stopped. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you all very much. So the certificate is designed to answer that need, which is to say, you can be enrolled and do a, let's say, traditional master's or PhD in any engineering department. Now, in those programs, the selection of courses, there will be typically just a few required ones, and then some distributional requirements, and then just free electives, not unlike college. And so to do the certificate, it just means you commit your flexible courses to some courses that pertain to the certificate. Actually, so the big commitment is the core course, which I teach with other colleagues. Some of the other courses, there might even be one or two you would have taken anyway, but you put them in a package. And what this does is it causes you to look at the offerings across engineering, and in fact, even a few outside of engineering, which we very much support. And you dialogue with one of us as an advisor, and we say, you know, actually this other course is really relevant. I remember some years ago, a student said to me that he really wanted to get into solar cells. And I opened the catalog and I said, okay, over in electrical engineering, you need to take this transistors course, this microelectronic devices course. And the student was like, hey, no, I want to do solar cells. And I said, if you really want to understand how electrons and holes move around, and the course had a little on solar cells, a little on light emitting diodes, a little on diode lasers, it's all the same physics. It just sort of is wrapped up in different ways. Are you driving a voltage? Are you producing a voltage? Low level, high level? Does the material have defects? Does they kill you? Do they not kill you? Right? And so in retrospect, it's really simple. But at the time you say, no, I'm not a microelectronics jock. And my advice was, go learn absolutely everything in that course, and then you'll know the real problems of solar cells. Because they're tough devices to engineer. It sounds simple, but the reality isn't. I sang in during lunchtime in an early music choral group at Stanford. Actually, my hobby, I continue to take singing lessons. I've actually been taking singing lessons with an opera singer over the internet, which is kind of interesting. So we were in a choral group, and which sang music up to J.S. Bach, right? He was about as modern as the group went. And then we would have lunch after rehearsal, right? So, you know, you meet people doing the things you love. I grew up on the East Coast. I went to grad school on the West Coast. I frankly had somehow not noticed U of I. You know, I flew over it. But it turns out in my field, U of I is a powerhouse. I mean, there are plenty of great people in many places, but it turns out U of I was a powerhouse. And when I came to look at it, there were in fact 2 professors that were doing fantastic things, and I would be happy to work with either of them. Now, if I could say, I mean, if I had come and there had been just nothing, I don't mean to criticize, but you can go somewhere, you know, maybe you check out a department and it's really aging and the excitement isn't there. Not a good choice, right? I think my wife and I might have decided how to reconfigure and make it work. But if I could say, many of you are considering graduate school, and one thing I wanted to mention is, you know, undergraduate, you pick a place because, hey, it's a great school and this department seems to be great. right? But graduate school, of course, you want a very, very good school with facilities and so on. But really, it's a mentorship with a particular professor doing research, if you're doing a PhD. As a master's student, it's still largely classwork based. But a PhD, you're in a particular group. You're actually being hired by the professor who has gotten money from a grant. So you're being hired, and of course, the professor has to be impressed with you as an up-and-coming person, but you have to be impressed with the group. So when you pick a grad school, it's very important to go somewhere, as a rule, where there are at least 2 faculty members you're excited about, hopefully 3. And the reason for that is, let's say there's only 1 and you show up. There are a couple of possibilities. One is you show up and you're there for a while and you learn more about the group and you think, I'm not perfectly at home in this group. Or you show up and the professor says, I'm delighted you're here, but I've had a funding crash and I have no position for you, which is what happened to me at Stanford, right? The faculty member that really recruited me, I had a complete first-year fellowship, but the second year he had a funding crash and he couldn't take me. Now, fortunately, there were lots of good people, so I found an alternative opportunity that actually broadened my experience, which on balance I think was a good thing. But I was not working with the person I came to work with. You know, is a shame. I had to find others to get that mentorship experience. A very good question. This depends on the school and may even depend on the department. I am aware of some very big departments, 100 faculty members, where the process would be unwieldy unless people were assigned. And so they actually want students to select a group and be at least provisionally in a group right from day one. Now, switching afterwards is possible, but now in our department, we do it differently. And I should back up and say, in engineering, when you get accepted to a graduate school, they pay to fly you out and visit. Life until COVID, they would pay to fly you out. And so if you spend your 2 days on campus, dialogue with a faculty member, and you think, and by the way, you also dialogue with the grad students in that group. And you say, tell me about life in the group. And professors don't try to hide that because they're proud of how the group runs and what their grad students do. But if you visit and you just hit it off, so to speak, and you can tell the department, I really want to work with Professor X, and they'll honor that. Like some places you'll have, let's say physics is teaching physics to the entire campus. And so they need a zillion teaching assistants. So everybody is supported the first year being a teaching assistant, something like that. We don't have that. So our compromise is you come and for the first 6 weeks, you can be unassigned. And during the first 6 weeks, you make appointments, you circulate around, talk to faculty members. And faculty respect this process. We don't try to grab students. Although when we meet a great student, we say, I'd love to have you in the group. But you talk to people, often and advisably more than once. And then you say to the department, and I've watched this at work for 25 years. And it works because, the PhD commitment is a rather big commitment, like 5 years from the bachelor's. And it only makes sense for both parties, the professor and the new group member, if it looks like, hey, you love this topic, you're ready to go, you meet the other grad students, you sense a, happy and energetic dynamic, you can't really do the PhD thing unless you're genuinely excited about it. It's not an alternative, oh, I'll go to work or I'll get a PhD, right? If you want to do the PhD, there's only one condition when you should do graduate school, and that's you seriously think you want to, right? It's a great experience, but it's a big commitment. And it's research, which means lots goes wrong before things go right, right? And I can tell you countless stories of, my group members coming in all dejected because this and that and the other. One of the funny things is in so many of these stories, something went wrong and it caused us to make use of the phenomenon and invent something new. Actually, we've had a lot of failures turn around. May I give you one example? I had in my group the top student from Tehran, a lovely lady named Elham. She went to Sharif, which was their top school. So she came and she was growing a certain class of thin films. And she's very polite, very polite. But she came in my office one day and she said, I'm frustrated. I try and my film, she was trying to grow a film on an oxide surface. My film will not grow. My film just will not grow. And I said, Elham, you know what's interesting about that? She said, what? I said, your film will not grow because in microelectronics, one of the things that's desperately sought after is called selective growth, where you may be in the middle of making a chip and you have a pattern, let's say of metal pads or lines, and you're going to grow the next layer on top of it. And traditionally, you just put down metal everywhere and then etch off what you don't need. But that requires a pattern which is aligned to nanometer precision and then etching. And instead, could you arrange that the next film grows only on the areas that already have metal and zero on the bare oxide surface? So Elham had discovered, slightly by accident, a particular chemical route that utterly turned off film nucleation on the oxide. And she's got several wonderful publications on that. And my big joke, which isn't a joke, is she's the first member of my group who was awarded the PhD for not growing a film. Right? But so it started as, darn it, it doesn't work. And doesn't work turned into her whole thesis. Whatever it is has to generate some real excitement for you, right? There's no way you can manufacture excitement and have the tenacity to do something for years if it really isn't your thing. My general advice, though, is to look for a group which has the most intellectual life in it. And I don't mean that academically. What I mean is, it is possible to see groups. I need to nuance this a bit. Some groups work close to technology. Now, on the one hand, there are many cases in which a huge impact in the world could be made by solving a problem that's been around. And this group is chipping away at a long-standing problem. Now, that's okay if they're bringing really fresh insights to it, right? But, I go to conferences and so on. You see a lot of work happening, And the other phenomenon you can see is people chipping away at the same old problem, but it's more like chip, chip, chip. Now, if you were in a group like that, you'd get a lot of experience, you'd learn research skills, you'd get a job. It could be fine anyway, but what you would not have enjoyed is the kind of group that says, you know, by reading the literature and thinking fundamentally and thinking creatively, we can identify kind of a whole new space of opportunity and take our little voyage off into something that's really not been done before. And I will say that's, you know, if that's not your thing, it's fine. But I would say you want to really look out for, you know, do I hear the just chip, chip, chip sound? Or when I speak to the professor, and by the way, when I speak to the other grad students, are they saying, well, you know, there's this unexplored area and we had this idea and there was this unexplained thing and we turned it around and we're making use of it. In that regard, so I would say, just do your evaluation, but I would say the strategy is not to say, well, okay, I love solar cells, therefore I'll only look at solar cell groups. Now I say that as a person who was kind of born and raised on solar cells, right? So I'm not knocking my, you know, my own beloved area. But I think it's important to have the most, you know, really do research in a way where you say, okay, let's step back. What are the phenomena here? Are we really thinking of this in the broadest way? Maybe there's some aspect that, right, we can really do differently. And if you tackle that, then you get to be, you know, a really great researcher. You don't want to end up being kind of a super technician. I know every technique in the world, but the problem I'm working on, it's been around, it's still around, it will be around. Now, I can give you an example of something that's kind of crosses the space, and it's in chemical engineering, right? So it might be interesting. I gave a talk once at Case in Cleveland. I was invited by a professor of chemical engineering who was working on the extraction of titanium from ore. Now, the world's been doing that for a long time, let's say a century. And it's an electrolytically driven process, which happens to be very inefficient. It's very reliable, but very inefficient. So if you know anything about this business, compared to easy materials like steel, it already takes a lot of energy to extract aluminum from ore. In titanium, it takes 50% more than aluminum. It's really off the charts. So he said, you know, I've come up with a whole new electrochemical cell design. It involves some very clever transport and separation processes in the cell. And he said, the thing is, there's a lot of titanium in the Earth's crust. If we could make our process work, we could get the extraction of titanium to be hopefully more like steel, but at least closer to aluminum. Now, can you imagine if we had titanium available in the quantities that we have aluminum available? What would happen in terms of energy and sustainability? Well, all of these flight vehicles, automobiles could start using lightweight titanium as a structural material. We'd save a lot of weight. So we have not only the energy savings extracting the titanium, but the much greater energy savings of having lighter weight vehicles. So he was able to think of, break out of the box. We're not going to do titanium the way we've done it for a century. Let's think about how this electrochemical separation really works. And so he came up with a whole new geometry. And if it's a long shot, and he knows it's a long shot, but if it worked, the sustainability implications would be really big. And implications that are big are measured in gigatons of CO2 per year going in the atmosphere. So what he was working on might have the potential to knock off some gigatons. Talk just for a minute about the advantages or possible drawbacks of being out working and then going back to grad school. And it's basically, if you go out for 1 year and you're doing something where you're learning, in other words, if you're flipping hamburgers, not so great, but you'd be working for an agency, doing whatever. Being out for a year is no questions asked. Hi, hey, welcome back. If you're out for 2 years, that's still fine. But what often happens when you go out to work with a bachelor's degree is you learn a lot the first year. And then if you're not careful, the second year is pretty routine. So you're not really learning at such a high rate. And meanwhile, all the stuff you did at college, those equations. But it's good to be aware of this. And when you apply to grad school, you can say, okay, in the second year, I changed my position in the company. I bid off a new opportunity, whatever. In other words, there's a narrative, what I was doing that kept my brain actually learning. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're out 3 years, you really need a good narrative. Now, I was out 3 years, but my narrative was pretty easy. Did all this research and published at Solar Energy Research Institute, went to this well-known lab in Paris. We published some great stuff together. So I had a ton of research experience by the time I got to grad school. Either works. During the years when I was involved in graduate recruiting here, when we got a deferral, it was actually pretty rare that the person would then come. So that has no reflection on you guys. I'm just saying, be that as it may, it's small numbers, and so there's a lot of randomness to it. But we saw a number of cases in which, they never came. I think the good news here is that graduate schools are looking for very interested new students. And unlike maybe medical school, it's not wildly oversubscribed. It's not like we have this, mountain of resumes we can't even look at, and so you have to be 4.0 to even get your foot in the door. I wasn't 4.0. And so you should consider, here you are doing an REU, right? You're already someone who's sought opportunity, gained extra experience. I'm sure you're doing well in school. You'll have a lot to talk about on your application. So I think you can anticipate that, schools will definitely want you. So you need to do the good work, but I would say don't worry about it. Just put your energy in doing the good work, right? It's not like applying to med school, so just don't don't freak out. I should really say, on the positive side, I think maybe I've emphasized some cautions. On the positive side, it can really help you decide what's right for you, right? For example, in an REU program, you guys are doing research, albeit under the COVID conditions. But I've seen a lot of students go off and do research, and some of them come back and say, I love it, I'm going to do grad school. And others say, research. So, okay, I did it. It was fine. It was cool, but that's not my career. Or we have other students who go off for an internship in industry. I've seen a lot of this too. And they come back, and then I tell you the same two stories. They either say, industry, I'd love to get a job. Let's get out there, right? And others say, yes, industry. It was nice. I made some money. Where's my grad school application? And you have to realize there's seriously no value judgment here, right? If your heart says research, yes, the unknown, 5 years at an RA salary, cool, we want you. But if something else calls to you, that's your contribution in the world, right? I mean, seriously. So yeah, go out. If you're just not certain, you work for a year and you talk to a lot of people, right? And people will tell you, here's what I love about what I'm doing. And you can really ask them the question, by the way, what would you have done differently? What's your advice? Maybe you hear a lot of people say, I wish I had done that next degree. I wish this, I wish that. Well, that's all part of your data bank. And then you can translate, okay, this was their situation, I get it, but sort of what's the take-home message from my situation? And move forward with that. Now, the virus won't last forever. It's going to have a pretty significant impact for a couple of years. I mean, we're really hoping that widespread vaccination happens, but boy, that's not going to be instantaneous. Mm-hmm. But what can I say? I had great grandparents who lived through the Great Depression, right? And they talked about it. And I mean, I even had a great aunt. She lived to be 98, and I interviewed her late in life. She was an 18-year-old in New York City at the time of the Spanish flu, the 1918 flu, when a quarter of the city died. So you talk to some of these older relatives and you get everybody who lived through World War II and all this stuff, right? You talk to older relatives and you realize giant catastrophes happen and then eventually they're over. So life goes on, right? I mean, I know that's not science, but I'm just saying, boy, an awful lot happens in life. And eventually there's resolution, and then you emerge into a new period with a lot of opportunities that just a few years earlier were not on the radar screen. I had a variety of other involvements. In college, here at U of I created a program. Actually, in college, as a volunteer with a couple of other people, we created a whole volunteer activity. It was a bicycle repair program that educated juvenile delinquents in the city where we lived. So I could have been involved in a much more hands-on activist kind of role. And that was very appealing to me. And I did some other things. I actually took a year off from college, which I hadn't bothered to mention. And speaking of blacksmithing, I learned blacksmithing for a few months in the fall. And then I spent the other half of the year in Southeast Nigeria, where I was learning blacksmithing in the traditional blacksmithing villages. And then I taught at a fairly remote high school, secondary school. And that was fascinating and really raised a cultural awareness that you get when you travel internationally. Not just travel, but live somewhere, which is different, you know, not just being the tourist, right? So yeah, there are these other walks of life that interested me. You know, you realize it's unresolvable because each of us has at most one life to live, right? And the one thing I would not recommend, so I guess when you're young, it's good to have experiences, right? You know, okay, I live in Nigeria for a few months. That's fine. Eventually, though, you really figure what really appeals to you the most, and you do that seriously. I think that's my overall message is when there's something you really want to do, then great. You go and you really do it, right? So that you have the satisfaction of making an impact, really learning. Somebody once said, you know, should I learn the tricks of a trade? And the answer was, no, you don't learn the tricks, you learn the trade, right? Whatever you're doing, you do it really well, and that leads you to other things. And, you know, there are other possibilities. There are people that work maybe in research for a while, and then they do a pivot. You know, they may go off and be entrepreneurs. Or even very different from that. And we have a lot of undergraduates who do material science and then go off and do law school or med school or business or whatever. But the fundamental training they have in the science is not just material science, right? Any of the things you guys are doing really serves them well. You think rigorously, you have problem-solving skills, you understand when things have a clear mechanistic connection, or know when it's a systems environment, or when there's correlation but not causation, how you do math, right, to have a basis for projections, all this stuff, right? You have this huge knowledge base that serves in many other areas. Certifications, I think, usually come from an established professional body, like the professional engineering exam. Mm-hmm. What we have is a certificate, but that's just internal to us. The basic story, and it may be different at different schools or a little bit modified. It is possible to set up a minor for a graduate student. Just like as an undergraduate, you can have a major and a minor. The structure, unfortunately, requires so many credit hours. So to get around this in a way, our school has this thing called certificate, and it has to be approved, but it's much more flexible. Yes, and we needed something much more flexible because I forget the numbers. Oh yes, when I was starting this development, I went off to the graduate college and I said, hey, I'm thinking about this topic. And they said, oh, you'll want to set up a graduate minor. All you have to do is commit 32 hours to the topic. And I thought, 32 hours in the classroom? This isn't going to fit with anybody. So, right? So it's like 10 minutes into the conversation, I knew that wasn't the pathway. I will say, if you're going to go out and going to have a career in engineering, you hear of a lot of people who do take some form of professional engineering exam. But let me say, in graduate schools, those of you going to graduate school, it varies a little bit, but typically after the first year, you'll have a qualifying exam to get to the PhD. And this is kind of interesting because you go to grad school and in the first year, you take a suite of classes, most of them required. So in material science, it would be things like, you've taken thermodynamics. you've taken phase diagrams, you've taken whatever, right? So you take these classes, you get an A, and towards the end of the first year, we say, hi, you have to pass qualifying exams. Okay, what are they in? Well, maybe thermodynamics, maybe phase diagrams. And you could say, but I just took the graduate class and got an A, right? Why are we doing this? And the answer is it's not just a hoop to jump through. The qualifying exam is oral, so you have a blackboard, but you discuss with a couple of professors how you would approach certain problems. And it's interesting, you can be an A student in the class, but if I send you to the blackboard with a piece of chalk and I say, hi, hey, tell me how so-and-so works. Have any of you had that experience? You go to the blackboard and you think, oh yes, we know this. Right. Now let's see, how did that go? But you're the person who got the A in the class. So on our website, we describe it as being analogous to fluency in a language. I'm sure a lot of you have studied a second language, right? Or even a third language. So you take the class, right? Or you take classes for years. You get A's. Then I put you on an airplane. You go to a country where that's the language. You step off the airplane. Are you fluent? Right? But you've taken classes for years. Well, the thing is, in the classroom, frankly, it's kind of cozy. I've got my textbook, I have my homework, I have my exam. I'm not criticizing it, right? You're doing a ton of important learning. But when you step off that airplane, are you fluent? And you suddenly discover, oh my God, I can't really do this well. So going back to the qualifying exam, it changes gears because now you have to have the knowledge in your head in a way you can talk about. And that's really different from the world of the textbook and the homework and the exam. So the point is not actually the fact of passing the qualifying exam. The point is the different kind of studying you do leading up to that. Which is to say, students say to me, how should you practice for the qualifying exam? And my answer is, don't open a single book. And they say, what do you mean? I say, get some study partners. And what I mean is the smartest students in the class. Take turns. Somebody goes to the board with the piece of chalk and the others just start asking questions about the basic topics. Not trick questions, the basic topics. And you're at the board and you think, oh my God, I don't really know that, right? And it's frightening. And then you run home and you open the book and your mind says, you know what? I'm gonna learn that now and I will never, ever forget it again. Frankly. Right? So everybody's smart, but it turns out learning has all these different qualities. And fluency is something that's just typically not taught, not part of an undergraduate program. But what is it like if you're going to be a researcher, or for that matter, go to industry? The knowledge has to be fluent. You have to think, oh, this problem, oh yeah, this is a diffusion reaction problem. Yeah, you know that boundary condition is going to matter, right? Or electron tunneling might happen at this thickness range, right? It's not going to have a temperature dependence, so it's going to, right? Or, my solar cell, I measure my solar cell and the ideality factor isn't 1, it's 2. It's dominated by a certain kind of recombination, isn't it? You're not running back to the book. You actually know stuff. So you know, again, it's another thing where I end up saying, but don't hang around worrying, oh my God, will I pass the qualifying exam? You realize what it's actually about and you go and you do the good work, right? And you realize I'm about to learn something that I've never learned before, namely the fluency. And by the way, it's like any new skill. You will not build a new skill in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. I tell students, you start going to that blackboard months and months in advance and take a couple weeks to realize all the things for which you got an A and you don't know them. And then you'll know what to do. None of this is intended to be intimidating, right? You just need to realize, oh, that's what it's about. I think I better get on with it, right? And then imagine how you feel, right? You pass quals and you realize, I'm at a whole different level. But that's why you went to grad school, right? That's why you're there. In our department and in many departments, there's also the preliminary exam where you present your research topic. And the talk is not more than 30 minutes, and you have a write-up, which your professors have read, not more than 10 pages. And sometimes students say to me, gosh, you know, this whole complicated topic, and I only get 10 pages to write it up. The literature review, what I'm going to do, why it makes sense. And I say, let me show you this proposal to the National Science Foundation. How long can my text be? It is absolutely limited to 15 pages, but I have to commit about 5 pages of that to reporting what I did with the last grant, telling you about broader impacts that I did, telling you about societal relevance, which blows 5 pages. So, prelim exam, you get 10 pages, I get 10 pages, right? So, you're complaining about having 10 pages? Well, you know, that's actually generous. So you have to learn another new skill, which is how to take a complicated topic and distill down to what's really critical and put it together in a sensible narrative. Here's why it's important. Here's the state of the art. Here are the opportunities or the things we don't know. Here's how we're going to approach it. Here's why our approaches have more than a small chance of making progress. Here's how we're going to interpret that. All in 10 easy pages. It's another skill. It's just another skill, right? And you do it and you pass, right? And off you go. Thank you. It's my pleasure. Good luck to all of you. All right.